When I woke up to the sound of hammering in my barn, I thought maybe I was dreaming. After all, who would be stupid enough to start building something without permission on a ranch that had enough "no trespassing" signs to make a blind man stop? I slipped on my boots and headed out, the early morning air crisp and still carrying the scent of last night's rain. As I rounded the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. There were 5 men unloading construction materials into my barn like they owned the place, laughing and joking about how fast they needed to get it ready before Karen came by for her bait inspection. I stood there for a moment, utterly dumbfounded, half expecting a hidden camera crew to jump out and yell surprise. Instead, one of the men gave me a lazy wave and went right back to drilling. That was the moment I realized today was going to be anything but normal. I approached the men calmly, hands in my pockets, watching as they set up what looked like shelving units and hauled in plastic storage bins. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice level. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" One of them, a guy with a scruffy beard and a sun-faded baseball cap, glanced at me and shrugged. "Just doing what we were told, boss. Karen said we could use this barn for the new community storage project. Said it was part of the neighborhood expansion." I blinked, trying to process the words. Neighborhood expansion? Community storage? Karen? None of it made any sense. This was my barn on my private ranch, miles away from the HOA's official boundaries. Before I could say another word, a shiny white SUV pulled up, dust kicking up behind it. Out stepped Karen herself in full glory, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched arrogantly on her nose, and that smirk that screamed, "I am better than you, and I know it." She marched over like she owned the ground she was walking on and thrust a packet of papers at me without so much as a good morning. "This barn is now part of the HOA expansion plan," she said crisply. "It has been reassigned for community use under the new Neighborhood Beautification Initiative." Her voice had that syrupy fake sweetness that barely hid the iron underneath. I flipped through the papers she handed me. They were a mess of meaningless jargon, none of it signed by any legal authority, and most importantly, none of it even mentioning my name or address. I smiled politely and handed the papers back. "Karen, you might want to double-check your map. This land is not part of your HOA." Her smile faltered just slightly, but she recovered quickly, tapping the clipboard with an acrylic nail. "It has all been decided already," she said with an air of finality. "You can take it up with the board if you have an issue." The workers behind her snickered, clearly feeling emboldened by her presence. I stared at Karen for a long moment, my mind racing. I could have started shouting. I could have called the sheriff right there and then, but something deep inside told me to wait. There was an opportunity here, a delicious opportunity that I did not want to squander. Let her dig herself in deeper. Let her think she was winning. I forced a casual shrug and said, "All right, if you say so." Karen beamed, mistaking my compliance for surrender. She spun on her heel and barked at the workers to keep moving. As I walked back toward my house, the old boards of the porch creaking under my boots, I pulled out my phone and started making some calls, first to my lawyer, then to the county records office, and finally to an old friend who worked in land surveying. If Karen wanted a war, she was going to get one. She just had no idea she was picking a fight with someone who owned the battlefield, the weapons, and the high ground. From my kitchen window, I watched as the workers continued setting up like busy little ants under Karen's command. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sipped it slowly, a small grin playing on my lips. She thought she was powerful because she controlled a neighborhood of cookie-cutter houses with freshly painted fences and identical mailboxes. She thought she could march onto my land and claim it like some kind of suburban conquistador. She had no clue that not only did I own the barn, but the entire stretch of land from her precious subdivision all the way to the river 5 miles out. Every blade of grass, every fence post, every cattle trail. It was all mine, bought fair and square years ago when nobody else wanted it, back when this was considered too far out in the sticks to be valuable. And now her shiny new HOA development was trapped like a rabbit in a snare, completely surrounded by land that belonged to someone she had just made her #1 enemy. I leaned back in my chair and laughed softly, the sound echoing in the empty kitchen. Today was going to be very, very interesting. By late afternoon, the barn looked like a circus. Karen had even called in a landscaping crew to start planting flowers around the entrance. She had a banner strung up that read, "Future site of Willow Creek Community Storage Center. Residents welcome." I watched as residents from the neighborhood trickled in, some looking confused, others chatting excitedly about how nice it would be to have extra space for their bikes and lawn chairs. Nobody questioned it. Nobody wondered why there were no official signs from the county, or why the barn looked nothing like any HOA project they had seen before. They just accepted it because Karen said it was happening. And that was enough. I decided to pay one last visit before the sun went down. I sauntered over casually, hands in my pockets, whistling a lazy tune. Karen spotted me and immediately plastered on her brightest fake smile. "Glad to see you came around," she chirped. "We're planning a little grand opening ceremony next week." I nodded slowly, pretending to admire the flower beds. "Sounds great, Karen. Really great. You all worked so hard today. Be sure to enjoy it while you can." Her brow furrowed slightly, sensing something in my tone she did not quite understand. But she was too busy playing queen bee to think too hard about it. She waved me off and went back to bossing around her workers. As I turned back toward my house, the last rays of the setting sun painted the barn in golden light. It looked almost peaceful standing there at the center of the brewing storm. Little did Karen know, the foundation she thought she was building was about to crumble right out from under her feet. Tomorrow, the real fun would begin. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, my mind already racing through plans. The first step was gathering proof. I needed to make sure every inch of my land ownership was locked down tight. I brewed a strong pot of coffee, grabbed a notepad, and started scribbling a list of everything I needed: deeds, surveys, historical maps, anything and everything that could legally tie the barn and the surrounding land back to me. By 7:30, I was pulling out of the driveway, heading straight to the county recorder's office downtown. It was a small building with faded paint and a crooked sign, but it held the keys to Karen's upcoming disaster. The lady behind the counter was named Martha, an old family friend who had been working there longer than I had been alive. When she saw me, her face lit up, and she waved me over. I explained the situation in a low voice, not wanting anyone in the waiting area to overhear. Martha listened carefully, her eyebrows shooting up higher and higher the more I spoke. When I finished, she shook her head and laughed under her breath. "That woman must have a death wish," she said. "Wait right here. I'll pull everything you need." She disappeared into the back and came out 15 minutes later carrying a thick folder. Deed after deed, survey after survey, all neatly stamped and recorded. Not only did the documents confirm that the barn was on my property, but they also revealed something even juicier. I owned the entire ranchland that surrounded Willow Creek Estates on 3 sides. The only access road in and out crossed land that belonged to me. Karen and her HOA were essentially landlocked, and they had no idea. I thanked Martha and promised to drop off a pie later that week. With the documents secured in my truck, I made my next stop at the county land surveyor's office. My buddy Travis worked there, a grizzled old man with a limp and a sharp wit. When I told him what was going on, he let out a bark of laughter that startled the secretary 2 desks over. "Sounds like you got yourself a live one," he chuckled. He agreed to come out that afternoon and mark off the boundaries with fresh survey flags, just in case Karen tried to claim confusion later. As I drove back home, a plan started to take shape in my mind. I was not going to storm over there and demand they leave. That would be too easy, too clean. I wanted Karen to keep digging herself deeper, to keep piling up offenses until there was no way she could wriggle free. I would be patient. I would be methodical. And when the time was right, I would lower the boom so hard she would not know what hit her. When I got back to the ranch, the scene had gotten even more absurd. Karen had brought in a portable toilet, a catering truck, and a few picnic tables. A group of HOA members milled around, sipping lemonade and admiring the so-called community center. It looked like a country fair had set up shop in my backyard without my permission. I stayed hidden behind the tree line, snapping pictures and recording video on my phone. Every worker, every sign, every smiling face would serve as evidence later. Travis showed up around noon in his battered pickup, toolbox rattling in the bed. He gave a low whistle when he saw the circus unfolding at my barn. He wasted no time getting to work, planting bright orange survey flags along the true property lines. Each flag drove another nail into Karen's coffin. The flags clearly showed that not only was the barn mine, but the dirt road leading up to it, the fields surrounding it, and even the little patch of trees Karen had started calling Willow Grove Park were all on my land. While Travis worked, I called my lawyer, a sharp woman named Diana, who loved nothing more than a good courtroom brawl. When I explained the situation, she was practically giddy. She instructed me to gather as much documentation and photographic evidence as possible and warned me not to engage directly with Karen or her workers unless absolutely necessary. Let them make the first move, she advised. Let them rack up the violations. It will make the case airtight. After Travis finished laying the flags, we stood on the hill overlooking the barn, sipping sweet tea and watching the madness below. "You sure you want to let this ride for a bit?" Travis asked, one eyebrow raised. "You could shut it down right now." I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "I want her to feel like she's winning. I want her to think she has it all under control. The bigger they are, the harder they fall." By late afternoon, Karen strutted around the barn like a queen surveying her kingdom. She barely glanced at the survey flags, assuming they were part of the landscaping project. One of her cronies actually tripped over a flag and laughed it off, joking about how clumsy he was. I could barely contain my grin. They were so confident, so utterly blind to the trap they were walking into. At sunset, I sat on my porch, legs stretched out, sipping a cold beer as the barn lights flickered on. The banner Karen had put up earlier now sagged slightly, the words "Future Site of Willow Creek Community Storage Center," looking sad and desperate in the fading light. Tomorrow, I would start tightening the noose a little bit more. A casual call to the local news station. A friendly tip to the sheriff's office about unauthorized construction on private land. Maybe even a quiet conversation with the fire marshal about unpermitted gatherings. As the stars came out one by one, I thought about how funny life could be. Karen had no idea that by trying to steal one barn, she had picked a fight with the one person she could least afford to cross. She thought she was dealing with some ignorant country bumpkin who would roll over at the first whiff of authority. She was about to learn that the only thing more dangerous than a man defending his home was a man with time, resources, and a deep, unshakable patience. I leaned back in my chair, watching the barn glow like a beacon in the darkness. Let her have her little parties. Let her enjoy her fake victories. Soon enough, the hammer would come down, and when it did, it would be swift, public, and absolutely unforgettable. The next morning started with the rumble of heavy trucks again, only this time it was worse. Karen had somehow convinced a few more contractors to come out and start making permanent changes to my barn. I watched from the window, coffee in hand, as they unloaded lumber, electrical wiring, and even a portable generator. It was almost impressive how far she was willing to take her delusion. I let them work for a while, carefully recording everything. By now, the barn was crawling with workers, installing shelves, repainting walls, and setting up what looked like a makeshift reception desk near the main entrance. It felt surreal, like I was watching a movie where the villain got bolder with each scene, not realizing the hero was just letting them run straight into their own trap. Around mid-morning, I decided to take a stroll out toward the barn. I didn't confront anyone yet, just wandered nearby, whistling a tune, pretending to be a bored neighbor. That was when I noticed something new taped to the barn doors. A bright yellow notice printed in large, bold letters claimed the building was now officially designated as HOA property and that all private access was prohibited. My name wasn't on it, no county or city seals, just the HOA's fake logo printed from a cheap home office printer. I took a few pictures, chuckling to myself. Every new stunt they pulled was another nail in Karen's coffin. Karen herself showed up around noon, stepping out of her SUV like she was the mayor. She had a new clipboard, a headset like she was running a presidential campaign, and an attitude that could have curdled fresh milk. She barked orders at the contractors, paced around on her phone, and loudly announced to no one in particular that the community center was scheduled for a soft launch event on Saturday. Residents are already signing up to reserve storage spaces, she boasted. She was calling local businesses to offer them rental spots for their promotional materials. She even mentioned putting a small coffee cart outside the barn to attract more foot traffic. It was stunning to witness the full force of her fantasy play out right before my eyes. Things escalated quickly after that. Later that afternoon, a pair of self-proclaimed HOA security officers showed up, dressed in matching blue polos with the HOA logo embroidered over the chest. They were armed with clipboards, two-way radios, and matching sunglasses, clearly feeling very official. They began patrolling the property, walking up and down the driveways, peeking into outbuildings, and jotting down notes. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing when one of them, a round man who looked like he had never run a mile in his life, tried to jump over a shallow ditch and ended up face first in a puddle. His partner helped him up while muttering about reporting the dangerous conditions of the terrain. I stayed quiet, filming everything from a distance. It was painful to let them roam free like that, but it was necessary. Every minute they spent on my land without permission, every word they said about claiming authority, was another layer of evidence for my eventual takedown. My lawyer had made it crystal clear. Let them rack up offenses, let them incriminate themselves without my interference. By evening, a few curious neighbors had wandered over, drawn by the noise and activity. Some asked questions, a few looked skeptical, most just accepted Karen's version of reality. She paraded them around the barn like a proud tour guide, explaining how the new center would benefit everyone by giving them a place to store overflow furniture, bicycles, tools, and gardening supplies. She bragged about future plans to build picnic tables, a dog park, and even a small playground, all without mentioning that she was building on land that did not belong to her. It was both hilarious and infuriating at the same time. Feeling the need to escalate matters even further, Karen started installing temporary signs along the dirt road leading to the barn. Community Access Road, one read. Another said, Future Home of Willow Creek Community Center. I almost dropped my phone laughing when I saw the third one, which read, Property of Willow Creek HOA, Members Only. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. She had no idea that each new sign, each new act of arrogance, was setting her up for a crash so big it would echo across the entire county. Determined to strengthen my case, I spent the evening gathering statements. Travis, the surveyor, agreed to give a sworn affidavit about the true property lines. Martha at the records office offered to testify that I had pulled all the ownership documents long before the confrontation. Even a couple of the neighbors who had wandered over seemed willing to talk, confused and a little concerned about how fast Karen was moving without any official paperwork. One older man, Mr. Wilson, told me he had asked Karen about permits, and she had snapped at him, insisting everything was approved and to mind his own business. That little nugget was pure gold. By the time the sun dipped below the hills, the barn had been completely transformed. String lights were hung from the rafters, picnic tables lined the entrance, and a big chalkboard sign stood proudly out front, listing upcoming HOA-sponsored events. It was absurd, ridiculous, and completely illegal. I sat on my porch that night, watching the barn glow in the dark, sipping a cold drink and letting the satisfaction sink in. Every ridiculous addition, every bold claim, every new footstep on my land was another weight dragging Karen deeper into the quicksand she had so enthusiastically jumped into. I thought about walking over one last time, just to admire the chaos up close, but I decided against it. Better to let her think she was winning. Better to let her build her little kingdom higher and higher, because the higher she climbed, the harder she would fall. Tomorrow was going to be a busy day. I planned to make a few more strategic phone calls, maybe even schedule a visit from the fire marshal to check out those electrical cords strung dangerously through the barn. As I locked up for the night, I felt an excitement I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about protecting my land anymore. This was about watching justice unfold in the most satisfying way possible. Karen had declared war, but she hadn't bothered to check who she was fighting. And now it was only a matter of time before the walls she had so arrogantly built came crashing down around her. The day of Karen's grand event dawned with a clear blue sky, the kind of picture-perfect day that would have made anyone think nothing could go wrong. I woke up early, made a strong cup of coffee, and sat on my porch swing, watching the workers buzz around the barn like bees. The parking area was filling up quickly with cars from the HOA neighborhood, and people in casual clothes carrying folding chairs and coolers were trickling in. Karen stood proudly at the barn entrance, wearing a bright red blazer and oversized sunglasses, her hair done up like she was hosting a charity gala. She strutted around, shaking hands, posing for pictures, and barking orders into her phone. It was such a grand performance that I almost hated to ruin it. Almost. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, the local news van I had tipped off rolled up quietly, parking near the road. A young reporter and a cameraman got out, pretending to be just another couple attending the event. I waved discreetly at them from my porch. I had provided them with a full packet of documents the night before, including property deeds, survey maps, and a timeline of Karen's unauthorized activities. They knew exactly what was about to go down, and were eager to catch every second on film. Right behind the news van came the sheriff's department. 2 deputies in crisp uniforms stepped out of their patrol car and began surveying the scene. They moved slowly, observing everything without rushing, making notes, taking pictures. Karen was too busy soaking up the attention of her HOA friends to notice the growing storm clouds on the horizon. At exactly 11 o'clock, the so-called ceremony began. Karen tapped a microphone, clearing her throat dramatically before launching into a speech about community spirit, togetherness, and how proud she was to lead such an innovative and proactive HOA. She thanked various board members by name, praised the residents for their support, and even hinted at running for a larger political office someday. It was all painfully self-serving, but the crowd clapped and cheered like they were at a rock concert. Just as she was winding down, I stepped forward, walking calmly toward the barn. I was not alone. Beside me walked my lawyer, Diana, holding a thick manila folder under one arm. The 2 deputies followed a few steps behind us, and the news crew subtly shifted to capture everything. As we approached, conversations stopped. Heads turned. Karen frowned, confused at first, then visibly irritated. "Excuse me," she said into the microphone, her voice dripping with annoyance. "This is a private event. If you're not part of the community, you need to leave." I stopped a few feet away, smiling pleasantly. "I think you'll want to hear what I have to say," I replied. I turned to Diana, who opened the folder and pulled out several documents. In a loud, clear voice, she announced that Karen and the Willow Creek HOA were being served with a formal cease and desist order for trespassing, unauthorized construction, vandalism, and illegal use of private property. There was a stunned silence, broken only by the click of cameras and the hushed whispers of the crowd. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She started to stammer something about official permissions and community projects, but Diana cut her off smoothly, handing the cease and desist papers directly to her. The deputies stepped forward then, informing Karen that any further activity on the property would result in immediate arrest. The color drained from Karen's face. For a moment, she looked like she might argue, but then she caught sight of the news camera aimed squarely at her and seemed to think better of it. Instead, she turned an alarming shade of red and began shrieking about how unfair it was, how she was only trying to improve the community, how I was being selfish and petty. Her voice rose higher and higher until it cracked, echoing off the barn walls. People in the crowd began backing away, murmuring among themselves. Some pulled out their phones to record the meltdown. Others simply turned and walked off, wanting no part of the disaster unfolding before them. One elderly lady even shook her head sadly and muttered under her breath about how Karen had always been too big for her britches. Karen's tirade ended with her throwing the cease and desist papers to the ground and storming off toward her car, muttering about calling her lawyer and filing countersuits. The deputies followed her calmly, explaining that leaving was her best option for the moment if she wanted to avoid being taken in for disturbing the peace. With the main drama over, The crowd dispersed quickly. Some of the HOA members tried to act like they had no idea what was going on, muttering about being missiled. Others were simply embarrassed, heads down as they shuffled back to their vehicles. The news crew caught it all, from Karen's public humiliation to the awkward, shame-faced retreat of her former supporters. Diana and I stayed behind to oversee the removal of the unauthorized signage. The deputies supervised while the workers dismantled the makeshift welcome booths, pulled down the banners, and loaded everything back into their trucks. By late afternoon, the barn was once again empty, save for a few stray balloons drifting across the dusty ground. As I walked back to my house, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. It had been a long game, requiring patience and restraint, but the payoff was worth every second. Karen had tried to steamroll me with arrogance and bluster, and in the end, she had destroyed herself without me ever having to raise my voice. That evening, the local news ran the story. The footage was brutal, showing Karen's meltdown in full, glorious detail. The segment ended with a cheerful note about the importance of respecting private property and the consequences of unchecked entitlement. I received texts and phone calls from friends and neighbors all night, most of them laughing, some congratulating me, a few asking if they could stop by for a celebratory drink. I sat on my porch as the stars came out, a cold beer in hand, smiling into the warm night air. The barn stood silent and peaceful again, bathed in the soft glow of the porch light. For now, the battle was won, but I knew Karen well enough to expect that she would not give up easily. There would be more moves to come, more desperation, and I would be ready for every single one of them. The next few days after the disastrous barn event were strangely quiet, almost too quiet. I knew Karen was still out there, plotting, licking her wounds, trying to find some way to claw back her lost pride. But on the surface, it was as if the entire neighborhood had gone into hiding. No more construction crews showed up, no more HOA security patrols roamed my land, and not a single balloon or banner fluttered in the breeze. I used the silence wisely, putting the next phase of my plan into motion. First, I called in a trusted local fencing company and scheduled an emergency installation. Within 2 days, a brand new sturdy barbed wire fence began snaking its way around the perimeter of my property, clearly marking the boundary between my ranch and the HOA development. Every 10 feet, I made sure a no trespassing sign was posted, bold and unmistakable. Private ranch property. Access forbidden without written consent. It wasn't just about the fence, though. It was about sending a message. I wanted every single resident of Willow Creek Estates to understand that their playground was closed permanently. No shortcuts through my fields. No dog walkers cutting across my land. No Karen-sponsored events disguised as community outreach. The ranch was mine, and every blade of grass on it was now off limits. As the fence took shape, I could see some of the residents peering out from behind their manicured hedges, whispering among themselves. A few even had the nerve to walk up to the workers and ask what was happening. The workers, polite but firm, simply pointed to the signs and said they were following the owner's orders. Karen made her move on the 3rd day. She came marching up the access road, flanked by 2 board members who looked far less enthusiastic than she did. Her face was set in a mask of forced confidence, but I could see the cracks beneath the surface. Her hands twitched at her sides, and she kept glancing nervously at the cameras mounted on my porch and barn. She was trying to project power, but all I saw was desperation. She stopped just short of the new fence and called out to me. I was standing on my porch, arms crossed, watching the show unfold. "We need to talk," she said loudly, trying to sound official, "about the community's access rights." I walked slowly toward her, taking my time, making her wait. When I reached the fence, I leaned casually against one of the posts and raised an eyebrow. "I don't think we have anything to discuss, Karen," I said. "This is private property. Always has been, always will be. You and your HOA have no rights here." Karen's face flushed to deep red. She pulled a folder from under her arm and waved it at me. "We have legal easements," she insisted. "The community has always used this land for access. You're cutting us off. You're causing hardship." I chuckled, a low sound that seemed to unsettle the board members flanking her. If you had legal easements, I said, you would have presented them at court. You had your chance. You lost. Now you're trespassing again. I suggest you turn around and leave before I have to call the sheriff." Karen sputtered, trying to form a coherent argument, but the words caught in her throat. Finally, one of the board members muttered something to her and tugged at her sleeve. She hesitated, glaring at me with pure hatred, but then turned sharply and marched back down the road, her minions scrambling to keep up. I knew that wouldn't be the end of it. True to form, Karen spent the next week trying every trick in the book. She sent passive-aggressive letters accusing me of harming community morale. She tried rallying the HOA members to file complaints with the county about my fence, claiming it was unsightly and hazardous. She even went so far as to leave a handwritten note in my mailbox offering to buy a strip of land for a new community access road, promising generous compensation. I ignored the letters, documented everything, and made sure Diana, my lawyer, had copies of each new stunt. Meanwhile, I made life just a little harder for the HOA. I installed gates on every access point, locking them securely. I put up motion sensor lights that flooded the boundary lines with bright light at night, making it impossible for anyone to sneak across without being seen. I even started plans to plant dense hedgerows along the fence line, creating a living barrier that would be almost impossible to breach without heavy equipment. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek Estates. Residents who once smiled and waved now avoided eye contact. A few brave souls actually came by to apologize, embarrassed by the whole situation. One older gentleman, Mr. Wilson, even brought me a homemade pie and thanked me for standing up to Karen. He said most of the residents had never agreed with her tactics but had been too intimidated to speak up. It was a small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. I had never wanted a war with my neighbors. I just wanted them to respect the boundary between their world and mine. Karen, however, had made it personal. She had tried to take what was not hers, and now she was paying the price. The final straw came when I received a frantic call from Diana. She had been tipped off that Karen was planning a secret HOA meeting to vote on whether to pursue legal action against me for the so-called access hardship. It was laughable. They had no case, no documentation, no standing, but I knew Karen well enough to realize she wouldn't stop until she had burned every bridge she could. Diana advised me to attend the meeting just to make sure everything was properly recorded. So a few nights later, I found myself standing at the back of the Willow Creek Community Center, arms folded, listening as Karen tried to rally the residents one last time. She stood at the front of the room, gesturing wildly, painting me as a villain, a heartless land baron who had cruelly cut them off for no good reason. But something had changed. The residents weren't buying it anymore. Murmurs of dissent rippled through the crowd. A few people stood up and challenged her claims, asking for proof, questioning why she hadn't gotten proper permits in the first place. One woman even accused Karen of wasting their HOA dues on unauthorized projects. Karen grew more frantic with each passing minute, her voice rising, her arguments crumbling. Finally, the HOA president called for a vote. Should the HOA pursue legal action against me, or should they formally recognize the property boundaries and drop the matter? When the results were tallied, it wasn't even close. An overwhelming majority voted to drop the issue entirely. Karen stood frozen at the front of the room, staring at the results in disbelief. As I walked out into the cool night air, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The battle was over. The fence was up. The land was secure. And Karen, the self-appointed queen of Willow Creek, had been dethroned by her own people. The stars overhead seemed a little brighter, the breeze a little sweeter. I smiled to myself, knowing that the final chapter of this ridiculous saga was just around the corner. A few days after the HOA meeting, the aftermath of Karen's downfall began to ripple through the neighborhood like a slow-moving wave. Word had spread far beyond Willow Creek Estates. People in nearby towns were talking about the outrageous attempt to seize a barn and the spectacular way it had all blown up in Karen's face. The local newspaper even ran a front-page story titled "The Battle of Willow Creek," complete with a picture of Karen mid-tantrum during the barn event. It was a masterpiece of storytelling, and for once, the media had gotten every detail right. I saved a few copies for myself, figuring they would make excellent conversation starters for years to come. Karen, however, was not handling the fallout well. She became a ghost around the neighborhood, the once proud queen bee who had marched around with a clipboard and a megaphone now darted from her house to her car with her head down, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Rumors swirled that she was receiving angry emails and calls from residents furious about the money wasted on the fake community center project. More than a few homeowners were talking about suing her personally to recover their lost HOA dues. At the next official HOA meeting, which I attended purely for amusement, Karen was formally removed from her position as HOA president by a unanimous vote. She didn't even show up to defend herself. A small, quiet man named Dr. Mitchell was elected to take her place, and one of his first official acts was to issue a formal apology to me on behalf of the Willow Creek HOA. The apology came with a signed document affirming that the HOA recognized my property boundaries and would have no further interaction with or claim over any part of my ranch. Diana reviewed the document carefully before giving me the green light to accept it. It was over, officially and completely. Karen's reign of entitlement had ended not with a triumphant speech or a grand gesture, but with a whimper and a rubber stamp. Still, I wasn't the kind of man to hold on to grudges. Once the dust settled, I decided it was time to move on and reclaim my peace. I held a small gathering at the ranch, inviting only true friends and neighbors who had stood by me or stayed neutral during the chaos. We grilled steaks over an open fire, drank cold beer, and laughed long into the night about the absurdity of it all. Travis, the surveyor, told the story of the security guard falling into the pond so many times that by the end of the night, it had grown into a full-fledged legend, complete with sound effects and wild hand gestures. At some point during the evening, someone suggested that I should put up a permanent sign on the barn as a reminder of what had happened. After a few more beers and a lot of laughter, we came up with the perfect idea. A week later, a large, professionally made wooden sign was installed right above the barn doors. It read, "Private property, no Karens allowed," with a simple silhouette of a woman with wild hair waving a clipboard. It was tasteful enough not to cause real offense, but obvious enough that anyone who knew the story would get a good chuckle out of it. Life slowly returned to normal. The fields grew tall with new grass, the cattle grazed peacefully, and the barn stood quiet and sturdy, just as it always had. Occasionally, I would see residents from Willow Creek drive by slowly, craning their necks to get a look at the barn and the infamous sign. Sometimes they would smile or even wave sheepishly. I always waved back. There was no point holding on to bitterness. Karen had been her own worst enemy, and in the end, justice had been served without me ever having to stoop to her level. As for Karen herself, she eventually sold her house and moved away. I heard she put it on the market quietly, avoiding open houses or public listings, and accepted the first decent offer she got. Nobody threw a going-away party. Nobody even knew exactly when she left. One day she was just gone, like a bad dream that fades with the morning light. I didn't miss her. I doubted anyone did. Sitting on my porch one evening not long after, watching the sun dip low over the hills, I thought about everything that had happened. It would have been easy to let anger consume me when Karen first invaded my barn. It would have been easy to shout, to threaten, to lose my temper. But by staying calm, by being patient, by letting her show her true colors in front of everyone, I had won more completely than I ever could have by force. She had destroyed herself with her own arrogance and pride. There was a deep lesson in that, one I would not soon forget. Sometimes the best revenge is not revenge at all. Sometimes it's simply standing your ground, knowing you're right, and letting the truth shine through. Bullies like Karen build their empires on intimidation and lies, but truth, patience, and a little strategic planning can topple the grandest castles built on sand. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I smiled to myself, feeling a rare kind of peace settle over me. The ranch was mine and would always be mine. The land, the barn, the fields stretching out toward the horizon. They weren't just property. They were part of who I was, part of my history and my future. And no one, not Karen or any other would-be tyrant, would ever take that away from me. In the end, all it had taken was a little patience, a lot of paperwork, and the stubbornness to stand firm when it mattered most. And maybe, just maybe, a sense of humor to carry me through the storm. Because if there was one thing this whole mess had taught me, it was that sometimes the universe has a way of serving up justice with a side of laughter. You just have to be willing to sit back, enjoy the show, and wait for the final punchline.